Good morning, party people, and welcome to Countdown to Classic. This is a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Each week we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated Classic servers. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and this is a show where it's not my opinion on World of Warcraft that counts, but yours. If you're new to the show, Countdown to Classic goes through your expert input on everything relating to the sure-to-be amazing World of Warcraft Classic. Now, I do apologize for there being no second episode last week, but I was struck down by a little bit of man flu, and my voice was not something that you wanted to be hearing late last week. I'm also moving house at the moment, which may mess with the release schedule over the next 2 weeks or so I apologize in advance for any kind of inconsistencies in publishing dates, but I have to put a roof over my head so that the show can go on. As for today's episode, strap in for a hardcore episode of Countdown to Classic. No, not X-rated, you filthy fans. I'm talking about hardcore rating, because for the next 2 hours we're going deep on everything and anything Naxxramas with Naxx veteran Ayle, who has run the instance many times in both the vanilla days as well as on private servers. And as you'll hear, it's obvious that he knows this amazing final raid like the back of his hand. Now, if you're enjoying these in-depth conversations that Countdown to Classic brings you on a regular basis, then please head on over to the show's Patreon page, which got a big overhaul recently, which I really hope all of you do please go and check out to see how you can help support Countdown to Classic to continue to bring you more of the content that you're now so used to hearing on the show. If you want to hit me up with some feedback or submit a memory lane or anger management story of your own, you can always hit me up at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com as well. You can also support the show further by joining the show's amazing Discord, leaving a review on iTunes. Those really help. If you're listening on an Apple device right now, please do go into the iTunes store and leave me a review, be it good, bad, whatever. Reviews do help. And also, you can follow the show on Twitter at Count2Classic with the number 2. That helps a lot too. Let's build those followers up. All the links for everything you'll need are mentioned in the show notes for you. If you just can't get enough of me for some reason, then please do also check out my other podcast, The Cinephiles. That's SINNERFILES.com. If you haven't already, for some great comedic takes on all your favorite movies between myself and my 2 crazy co-hosts over there. But with all that said, let's click our heels together with hardcore raider Ayle, as we say with each other, there's no place like Naxxramas. Alright, so we've got another caller on the line now for another Countdown to Classic interview, and who is it that we're speaking with? Introduce yourself.
Hey, my name is Ayle, and I was a 60 mage that cleared Naxx in vanilla.
Excellent. And that's obviously exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Everything and anything vanilla Naxxramas. So thank you so much, Ayle, for obviously putting your hand up for this particular interview. I've been asking everyone, if you are a veteran or an expert in a particular instance, please do come forward to me, as I'd love to talk about every single one of them at some point on the show. And you have nominated yourself to be the spokesperson for Naxxramas. So we'll go through your resume very soon. And basically give everyone an introduction into your experience with the instance. Now, I should point out as well that you've got another, by the time people hear this interview, you've got another very special call coming up on the show, probably in the episode following this one. So everyone, please do listen out for Ayle twice this week, I should say. So I really do look forward to bringing you both of those calls. But for now, we're doing Naxx. So lightning round, Ayle, as close to one word or short answers as you can to the following 10 or so questions. Now, where are you from in real life?
Vancouver, Canada.
Okay, and roughly what month and year did you start playing WoW?
I started playing WoW January 1st, 2005.
And how many years have you played WoW for?
Ever since. So
okay,
I
so
guess
still playing.
13?
What was your original main character's class and race?
Original main character was a 60 human mage.
Okay. And just out of interest, side question, what was the character that you rated Naxx with most regularly?
It was that mage.
Okay,
character.
fantastic. What was that character's name?
Ayle.
There you go, and that's Ayle, right?
That's correct.
Okay. How many other classes have you hit a level cap with?
In Classic or just overall?
Whenever.
I think probably 5 or 6. I had, in Vanilla was a mage and a warrior. And then in TBC I hit with a shaman. And then later on as well, a priest and a hunter. And a paladin most recently.
Okay. Which server did you play on when you started?
I was on Mal'Ganis, US.
And do you prefer PvP or PvE servers?
PvP, definitely.
And I think we know the answer to this question in vanilla, but post-vanilla, what's the highest raid that you went through?
I did a few bosses on Mythic and the most recent expansion.
At Legion.
Yeah.
Too
and
easy.
Taurus, that's it.
Okay. And obviously, you said you're still playing WoW. Do you play currently just retail or somewhere else as well?
Currently, I'm playing retail very casually. And previously, I had been playing on private server Chronos. But on Chronos 1, in that one, kind of the life cycle is completed. So after the announcement of Classic by Blizzard, I've decided I'm going to take a break until it comes out.
All right. Now complete this sentence so we know where your allegiances lie. For the
Alliance.
All righty. Now, just before we get into things, I'm not too sure. Do you have anything to plug? Are there any places online where people can find you and any work that you might do?
Not currently. I do have a couple projects underway that I hope to have complete for the release of Classic, but at this point, none of them are ready to plug.
Okay, thanks so much for that rundown of obviously your resume with the game. Now let's focus on Naxxramas, the subject of this in-depth interview. And I guess my layup opening question is going to be, just tell people about your Naxx resume. What did you clear? How often did you clear it? What was the story of your guild getting there and so forth? Everything that people need to know to convince themselves that you know what you're talking about with Naxx.
Okay, so originally in Vanilla, I joined a top tier reading guild pretty much as soon as I was max level. And from there, we built up with the community. Really, there was a bunch of different raiding guilds. And throughout the life cycle of Classic, I raided, MC through BWL and Naxx extensively. And going into Naxx, we'd actually, due to some server circumstances, a few of the guilds merged together to make kind of like a super guild. And based on this, like the most hardcore players from probably 3 or 4 different guilds joined up into a guild called Validus on Mal'Ganis. And basically we went into Naxx and raided 3 to 4 nights a week during progression until the instance was clear.
Fantastic. And so, do you remember roughly when you first walked through those big old double doors of Naxx, if I can put it that way, crudely? When you walked through the front door of Naxx for the first time, when it was and how you all felt when you got there, or how you felt personally?
Well, the first time I actually went through it was on the PTR. Some of us had moved characters across. So unfortunately, like my first time in Vanilla was a little bit anticlimactic, right?
Yep.
But being able to go in on the PTR, I remember just kind of the overall like aura and like feeling of the instance was so cold and like a prison. Originally, a lot of people don't know the instance in Vanilla, you couldn't actually zone out of the instance. So it almost felt like a prison. Once you zoned in, the only way out is death or heart, which is actually was pretty cool and added to the overall theme of it.
We've got a bunch to get through in terms of this interview. It could be on the longer side. So, because obviously there's so many encounters that are included in the Naxx content, and there's so many things outside of just the encounters that I want to discuss in terms of what we might be getting in Classic and your thoughts on a few directions that the team could take with Classic, and also just what it takes to get to Naxx and how you might sort of deal with life as a Naxx farmer or things like that. So we'll start at the very top, and it's more a general question in terms of the difficulty of Naxx, because Naxx is really rarefied air, quite obviously. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. But from someone who is doing it as often as you were, you're clearly in the top 1% of players in terms of people who have seen the content, because we talk now about how the vast majority of people never even saw Naxx in vanilla, yet you did on a semi-regular basis. So the reason you could get there is because you put in the time and effort to get the gear, and you were a skillful player with a skillful guild, and then you walked through the doors. So I'll start with this, and what we do here on the show is obviously we go through a few quotes, and I'll just run this one by you. So I'll start with this quote from user Thorowitz over at the official WoW forums, and they're referring to a video link about Naxx, and they say this: "This is a great video I found about how inaccessible content was at one point. It's hilarious how some think that having content this hard and accessible by so few is a good thing." So my follow-up question to you, Ayle, is, was old Naxx really that hard?
Definitely there were many encounters in Naxx that were just simply incredibly hard. A lot of the bosses had abilities that were extremely unforgiving. For example, they were untauntable. So if your tank lost aggro, you generally just wipe as it goes and clears through your raid. So it's actually really funny, because the instance was so difficult. We went back at level 70 with a full raid group, and we didn't one-shot every boss. We actually wiped for, I think, 2 to 3 hours on kel'thuzad. And that sounds like absolutely unbelievable. Like, how could that happen, right? He has like 3 or 4 separate abilities that are basically one-shots if you're not on your toes. Void zones deal, I think, like 200,000 damage. You stand in that, you die. Frost Blast deals 130% of your hit points. If you get hit by that and don't get a heal, you die. He mind controls the tank, so the second tank has to be top on threat. If that doesn't happen, you die. He runs around killing everybody. And then on top of that, he's doing AoE frost bolts for, I think it was like 1,500 to 2,000 every 15 seconds. As well as casting like a 9,000 damage frost bolt on your main tank that had to be interrupted. So all of the abilities, people say were kind of like overtuned, but it's really the penultimate like raid encounter for Classic. It required absolute perfection.
I'll follow this up with another quote, and this is from Wheelboy over at Reddit, and they said the following: "Naxxramas opened this morning on the most populated vanilla WoW private server, Lightbringer. It took this guild a little over 2 hours to complete it. There was no Naxx gear, obviously, no Naxx frost resist, no world buffs. With patch 1.12 talents, which obviously isn't Blizz-like for Naxx release, and the HP, armor, resistance, damage, etc., values were obviously just being attempted to mimic Blizz-like values, but there's no way to absolutely 100% verify that they are correct. That being said, they aren't outlandish values either. You can maintain that these aren't exactly Blizz-like mechanics, values, talents, etc., but all of that combined isn't going to make Naxxramas last even one full day. This is what vanilla WoW is now. This guild put in an extraordinary amount of time prepping for this, and they are obviously not indicative of how easy Naxxramas will be for the other 99.9% of classic WoW players, but you can expect the clearing of all raids come classic to be an easy task for the elite. So my follow-up question for you, Ayle, is this, and it's something that has intrigued me for this whole time that I've had the podcast, when we talk about the face rolling of content once classic rolls around. And obviously it's hard to say because we don't know exactly what's going to happen in terms of tuning, whether Blizzard does decide to retune any of the content. But let's say they don't. Let's say everything is as is. Do you think, given the way the elites have steamrolled Naxx on private servers, are you expecting Naxx to be viewed as slightly easier when Classic rolls around?
Without any rebalancing, I fully believe that it'll be easier. If you had asked this question of me maybe a year ago before I had my own private server experience, I probably would have disagreed with you. But after being part of that and seeing it, I fully agree. I believe that, like, as raiders, people have improved over time, and it really hurts the instance that it's been out for so long, where people can effectively master all the strategies.
In saying that, we talk about that top 1% or perhaps even less than 1% of players that saw the instance back in the vanilla days. Do you think that it's going to increase by much? Like, really, when we talk about the percentage of the player base that's going to see Naxx in Classic whenever it releases, what are you thinking? 10%? How high would you be prepared to go?
I think there'll definitely be an increase in the amount of people who get in there, but a lot of people kind of don't realize is that how much setup actually goes into, like, getting into Naxx. Even, for the average player. The hardcore people, the ones who are, like, fully dedicated, and that's their entire goal, they're not going to have a problem. But for the average person, you have an entire kind of year and a half setup just to be able to go into Naxx. You need to level up to 60. You need to get into Molten Core so you can get into BWL. BWL so you can get into AQ40, just so you can kind of, like, be able to get into an Naxx guild, or, be respectable enough to get in. And I feel like that amount of time is just, like, a huge amount of attrition on people. And for quite a few people, it'll be similar. Like, I think it'll be tough for people to devote that much time to getting into it. But at the same time, I think there will be more people doing this just because so few people have done it before. It's almost fallen into, like, a legend now about how few people were in the original vanilla Naxx, and that has a certain level of prestige to it, I think is going to drive a lot of people. If I had to guess for the amount of people that would actually kill KT on release, I would think probably somewhere between 5 and 10%.
I know it's all guesswork and it's way too hard to pontificate too much about it, but I do appreciate you taking a shot in the dark for the purposes of the show. I would put it somewhere in the same range, to be honest with you. I was going to say I'd struggle to see it being higher than 5%, but, if it is in that 7, 8, 9%, I can see it happening. But I'm with you in that. I think a lot of people, and I've been banging this drum for quite some time, a lot of people disregard the sheer amount of casual players that will be involved in World of Warcraft Classic when it drops. So you can cut out a vast majority of the player base that, a lot of people aren't even going to hit 60 when they play this thing. They're going to play for a few months, they're going to enjoy it, and they might tap out before 60. The people listening to this podcast will not be one of those people. Do you know what I mean? These are the hardcore fans of this game, listen to this show and other kinds of content online. The people who don't listen to this podcast, and obviously there's a shitload of them, there's hundreds of thousands of millions of them who don't hear this show, but they won't be the people who necessarily grind all the way to 60. Or if they do, they won't grind all the way to raids or even to the last raid being Naxx. So you just push that percentage further down to the most committed people. And even though there's more people being driven forward by that, as you say, the allure over time of this vaunted area of Naxx. Oh, I want to get to Naxx. It's like, the Holy Land, in a way. You got to do your pilgrimage there once in a lifetime. I'm with you in that regard. So I totally hear what you're saying. Anyway, I'll get down off my soapbox now.
and like that being said, I think it's totally fine for Classic. It's an entirely different beast than, the WoW of nowadays. And for people, like, not to hit max level or not to make it through Naxx in Classic, that's totally fine. Because, like, in my mind, like, vanilla Classic was more about the adventure, where, nowadays everything is so, like, reward oriented, you know what I mean? But then, like, just playing the game, exploring and making new friends, like, a lot of that was really the reward.
Well, I read a great post on Reddit the other day. Just a very short, sharp point that I'd never really heard of. Maybe it's been said somewhere else before and I just haven't caught it, but I tripped upon this one where they said, vanilla World of Warcraft feels like a world. Retail World of Warcraft feels like a hub. And I could not agree with that more in terms of like a player lobby that you log into, you fuck around for a little bit and then you get out. Do you know what I mean?
I totally agree. Just the fact that you had to travel everywhere gave the world a sense of meaning because you never know. You're on your way to an instance and you could get ganked. You could get ganked by a mob. I think a lot of people remember there's in Eastern Flaglands a Scarlet Patrol of elites where if you weren't paying attention and you were auto-running to the instance, they would kill you. They would stun you and you'd be dead. And I think having like a tangible amount of fear and danger in the world is good. And you just don't have that anymore. You can go directly to the instances. You queue into things from the cities. You never really have to leave the hubs to do anything. Where vanilla really gets you out in the world doing things with other people.
Unfortunately, I can't find that user's name. My internet is just screwing up a little bit now, but whoever that is, I apologize. It was a great point on Reddit, I thought, but we'll move on. So let's get through it. And we talk about, just to finish this up on the, sort of notion of difficulty. And we've talked about, recently on the show, the concept of retuning raids. And I found this great quote about Naxx. It says the following. I just want to see your take on it. It's from user PogChamp, who says this. Buffing raid boss HP would only create a perception for the need to optimize raid setups even more for maximum damage. Instead of guilds occasionally bringing in the underperforming specs like Shadow Priest, Feral Druid, or just more than 2 hunters, Blizzard might as well be signaling to players that they need to bring the very best players and raid setups to succeed. There's long been the mentality surrounding Blizzard's games that anything but perfect is shit, and it leads to everything getting min-maxed to the bone. If guilds want to compete, they'll find a way. There will be guilds on Classic that dedicate themselves to clearing content as quickly as possible. If guilds really want to compete, it will happen. So, my follow-up question is, if dungeon retuning were to happen, and let's just say Blizzard said, you know what, fuck it, let's just buff everyone's HP by 25% and bam, retuning, done. As this user is saying, that could be problematic. Do you agree with their take?
I definitely think so. I believe that they would have to have some sort of a PTR to balance it. I know previously when they released Naxx originally, I was kind of part of that PTR testing. And I think they basically put out patchwork and then watched guilds fight him to see, what kind of damage they could do, how much the tanks could soak, based on kind of the level of the skill of the players at that point. And I think if they wanted to make it so it was challenging again and had the feel of original vanilla compared to not actually going full no changes, they would have to do something like that, which would be like increased, some bosses have increased damage, things like that. The thing that really changed my mind about this was, again, the private servers, where for a lot of fights, our tanks, they wouldn't even be in full tank gear. Due to that, they were able to pull way higher threat, which means our DPS was able to go way harder. And it was totally different from the experience that I had in Classic. We often had to wait to DPS for a significant amount of time, often start wanding and whatnot. But yeah, applying a flat hit point boost, I don't think that would probably be effective enough.
Well, let's get into the setup or, the makeup of your Naxx group and what you might think to be an ideal raid that you would send through Naxxramas. So I'll take you through this quote from user Forest Eye over at Reddit, who says this. Generally speaking, this is the kind of makeup that I would be looking to take into Naxx. 8 warriors, 3 being tanks, 5 being DPS, 6 rogues, 6 mages, only 1 mage can get ignite later on per mob, 5 priests, 4 being healers, 1 being shadow, 5 warlocks, you do pretty insane damage later on in Naxx, 3 hunters with the trank rotation that can be sketchy with only 2, 3 druids, all healers, and 4 paladins. In the later patches, You have the option of dropping maybe a rogue or two if you have rogues that quit or decide to stop raiding near AQ40 or Naxx and replace them with additional mages or warlocks. You get carried pretty hard by casters in AQ40 and Naxx, and it can make progression a lot easier unless your melee know exactly what to do and how to avoid dying in such tight quarters. So, my question for you is, having heard that, would you tinker with that at all? What was your preferable 40-man raid group consisted of when going through Naxx? Keeping in mind that, it might be a different answer for the Four Horsemen.
Right. So, do you mean a private server or like on a re-release of Classic, or what we experienced in?
You know what? Let's go through all of it.
Okay. Well, in original, we honestly had trouble finding enough people who were like geared enough to actually go through Naxx. So at that point in time, like, we were recruiting off server, picking people up from lesser guilds and things. And at that time, our guild really stacked mages for the most part, mainly ranged DPS. I don't know why at that time we didn't really know that warriors could pull such high damage. It was possibly due to threat. I don't exactly remember. We did hear about other guilds, especially on Horde side, who had really good parses with warriors. But for us in Classic, we mainly stacked mages and warlocks. So, the big rolling ignites. Like, as far as that went, we also struggled having enough warriors just to do Four Horsemen. And that actually broke up like a shit ton of guilds because, at that point you needed to have, most guilds ran with 8 in case there were resists, right? And most guilds didn't have 8 warriors. We had to bring alts in and gear them up. Pick up people from other guilds, their geared tanks, which would essentially kill their guild, unfortunately. And it made it very difficult. Now, moving forward in the private server experience, I think you want as much melee DPS and mages as possible, I feel like. That being said, kel'thuzad is a little bit different. You want less melee and more ranged. But the numbers the guy listed are they're pretty accurate. I don't know if you'd want that many warlocks. I think it's probably better to have, as many mages as you can get without them pulling aggro from the rolling ignites. Obviously, I don't agree with having any of the suboptimal classes, Boomkin or Horrible, Ret Pally, no good.
On that point, when you say, obviously, there's a certain min-maxing element to it all if you really want to, get through Naxx. But what would you say to this quote from user Lanalai, who says, what's the ideal makeup? 40 competent and reliable players. This is the most important part. So when we talk about, suboptimal specs and classes in Naxx, would you think to a certain degree it's still possible to get through Naxx with those specs and classes that we sort of, whether it's deserved or not, meme about to a certain degree? Do you think they can still go through if they are skillful, competent, reliable players? Or do you still say, no, I don't want a bar of it, I want these classes and specs?
I'd say on a progression clear that no, you still wouldn't be able to take those classes. Really, it's just hurting your raid. We had talked about I believe that if there weren't any changes, to hit point values or things like that to make it, a vanilla experience, that it would be easier. But I don't think it would be easy enough where you could effectively give up multiple spots in your raid for, suboptimal comp.
Let's talk about what players need to keep in mind when they're getting ready for Naxxramas. So let's say you've blitzed the way through the content, you're ready to get to Naxx, you're done with AQ40, you're like, bring it on, let's go, next step. However, it's not necessarily just a matter of rocking up to the front door of Naxx and going through it. There's a bit of pre-raid preparation. So we read about it on the forums, and I'm sure you'll be able to tell us a couple of stories of pain and time. What kind of consumables or what kind of time and effort can you tell people to expect when they're getting ready to rock up through for a raid for Naxx?
If you're part of a guild that's full in on min-maxing, then I know for our raids on Chronos that we would have probably at least an hour of prep time before every raid. They didn't have world buffs for Naxx, but for the other raids, for example, and like that is pre-raid. I'm not talking about consumable farming or anything. That's just going around to get world buffs. You know, ZG buff, Oni head buff, Song Flowers, things like that. As far as consumables, it was, it's a huge amount required. There's some bosses that are nigh impossible unless everybody has the right consumables. Lotheb, for example, and Saffron.
In terms of when we talk about those consumables, I mean, you hear things like you're going to need a shitload of shadow protection. You obviously got all the flasks that you're going to be going through. Do you have any personal stories of being frustrated with the farming that you had to do pre-Naxx, or did you just get used to it?
I had expected to do Naxx right from the time that I decided to play on a private server. So I believe mine was a little bit different. So, while I was leveling, I made sure to keep an eye on certain items that I would need. After I had leveled to 60, I leveled the character up far enough that I could park at the Graveyard in Duskwood, and I farmed Grave Moss for almost the entire time that the server was up. I had parked another character to farm, for example, like the different elements required for the resist potions, things like that. So I had basically invested this whole time into being ready for Naxx prior to it even launching. But someone who doesn't do that, it requires a significant amount of farming. Like, I wouldn't recommend any less than 100 protection potions of each and maybe 200 of Greater Shadows.
Wow.
Before going into Naxx.
All right. My heart is breaking as I'm listening to you go through this shopping list.
You could do it with less. Like some of the earlier bosses definitely don't have that stiff requirements. But if you wanted to do a full clear Naxx and be fully ready, I think you would want to have that.
I'd be the guy turning up being like, the guild goes, all right, mate, you ready to go? What do you got on you? Oh, I've got 2 lesser healing potions.
Yeah, you're a liability. G-kick.
Absolutely. Okay, following on from that, relatively similar theme here. Listener Mumfo sent in the following listener question, and they asked you, how do you prepare for Naxx before it is released? Are there items that you'll hold on to for a long time, knowing you'll need them later on for Naxx?
Yeah, that question's actually like right in my wheelhouse. So, like I said, Grave Moss, I farmed that for as long as I could. Same with Dreamfoil. You need a shit ton of that for the resist potions. While I was kind of farming my early gear, like we did a lot of Ren runs, and the dragon there will drop different resist helmets, for example, and those are often a really good intro item for frost resist and nature resist, fire resist. So those are things I hang on to. Like, they seem really crap at the time, but some fights require like such high amount of resistance that you just need to have a high amount of those values. As well, like getting Argent Dawn rep as high as possible, because Naxx does have an attunement. If you're not exalted, it's not free, and the mats required for that are actually kind of expensive, like Arcanite bars and Righteous Orbs, right? One item that I got really cheap early on was a Dark Moon card, Heroism, I believe, which gives you a chance on melee attack to heal you for a small amount. It seems kind of garbage, but was actually really helpful for certain fights like Lotheb and Saffron. I actually was able to get by using less resist potions having that item. And then besides that, you need to have First Aid 300 most likely for Lotheb. Oh, there was one other item the Fisherman's Reel. I can't remember the name of it, but it's Nat Pagel's Reel, I think, from ZG. If you're a warrior, like, you need to get that item.
What does that one do?
It's pretty important. It gives you a bonus to hit chance, and where that comes into play is on the 4 horsemen. Basically, before you go into taunt, you pop that trinket. Otherwise, there's a chance that your taunt can be resisted, because it actually goes off the spell hit talents for warriors for whatever reason. and a missed taunt could very likely be like a raid wipe for you if you're not able to get that boss back on right away.
You're all over it because I've got a very specific question about that exact mechanic for the Four Horsemen in terms of, I did not know that the taunt went off spell hit, and I'm glad you brought that up now. You've teased your answer for later on, but we'll definitely get into that. Well, that's great. That's a fair few items there. Let me know if you think of anything else later down the line, but that's a great start for things that you might hold on to in terms of your preparation for getting into Naxx. But look, enough foreplay. Let's get into it now. We're going to talk about each and every encounter in Naxx. And what I'm going to do is, this is not a guide. There's a million places online. You can go and look up the specific strategies for each and every boss inside Naxxramas. Now, don't get me wrong. We might lightly, comment on that at times, but this is more about Ayles' personal experiences, any stories he might have from going through each encounter back in the day, and also just things to keep in mind that might not get talked about as often. So it's not going to be like, okay, on this boss, just do this, do that, do this, do that, and then you're good to go. We're going to be giving you a bit more color commentary on all of these encounters. So, or at least we'll try. Ayle, sorry, I'm not trying to put any pressure on you here, but don't be shy of talking about don't be shy of talking about the mechanics. I don't want to scare you off. It's just like, as I say, the guides are out there, and the podcast is not a good format for a guide necessarily. But let's start.
And 15 bosses is going to be pretty meaty.
Yeah, definitely. So we'll rip through all 15, but we'll keep it to, a few tight minutes on each one, and don't feel the need to rush, but we've got plenty of time, but we'll just go through it. So let's start with, I actually wanted to start with patchwork, even though I know that it's true that, most guilds might actually start in the spider wing. Isn't that right?
Yeah, usually guilds will start off in the spider wing.
Well, look, we'll start with patchwork just because that's where my notes start. So here we go. Now, the description for Patchwork over at WoW Wiki is that Patchwork is the first boss of the Construct Quarter in Naxxramas. He is typically seen as a gear check and is a prime example of a tank and spank fight. So this is a term that I've heard a lot, obviously, about Patchwork. People talk about gear check, and you hear that about a few encounters in the game, but really, this one, is it fair to say it is the granddaddy of all gear checks in World of Warcraft? Would that be right?
Yeah, I would say for Naxx, definitely. There were other fights in Classic that were also very harsh gear checks, like Baelistraz.
Mm-hmm.
And one that people often forget about in Naxx is Lothab as well. Because you needed to have the DPS to kill him before he did, too many of his AoE shadows. But, Patchwork having the enrage that he did was a big gear check. But actually, honestly, I think kel'thuzad was a bigger gear check than Patchwork, but not as many people got to it.
I know the numbers are fishy and it's a bit of guesswork, but I found a few sources that seem to come to the same figure roughly thereabouts. How did you go, and do you have any fun stories or any memories at all from back in the day of trying to burn through every single last one of those 3.85 million hit points that Patchwork had?
Well, I think the thing that kind of makes Patchwork kind of more of a unique gear check is that he was a gear check for all three raid roles, as opposed to a DPS gear check. Say his abilities, I know at the time were kind of unprecedented. The Hateful Strike, the off tanks hit for so much damage. You had to have really, really well geared tanks, at least tier 2, but likely better stuff. And because those tanks were taking so much damage, it was a huge gear check on the healers too. They had to be able to heal in a manner to keep those tanks alive for 5 to 6 minutes. This was in Classic, and your DPS had to be enough to beat that in rage time, right? So I think that's why a lot of people really talk about Patchwork as kind of being the super gear check, is that it was like a gear check across your entire raid.
I'll just put one little notion to you that's just come up in chat from previous Countdown to Classic interviewee AK, who's saying that he's of the belief, and appreciating what you've just said, that it's a great gear check for all roles, but What would you say to the suggestion that it's tipped slightly in the favor of being a bit more of a tank gear check? Would you agree with that or say, no, it's actually relatively balanced? Because I think your healer point was fantastic as well, that if the tanks are getting hammered, it's just as much of a punish on the healers.
Well, I know for us in Classic, it was kind of like a healer skill check as well, because they had to do like proper cancel casting and down raking, to conserve their mana. Where when I did it on private servers, it wasn't really that much of a gear check. We tended to steamroll everything. Everybody was so well prepared. We had the same tanks that we'd had for most of the game. So at that point, for us on the private servers, we were so well prepared, it wasn't really a gear check. As well, we had so many warriors and mages that we really just sliced through them with butter. But in the original version, a lot of people didn't know. People believed he was rooted, but you could actually pull aggro as a mage if you had the rolling ignite going the entire way, which did happen to my guild. And at the time, I can't remember who it was, but they definitely got an earful.
Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to thank AK here because I'm glad he's sort of jumping in as somewhat of a de facto interviewee, because I'm reading some great comments from here on the Twitch chat.
Yeah, that's great. Definitely bring it on.
Yeah, for sure. So AK is basically, he's obviously got a lot of Naxx experience as well. And one thing he's saying is that, and I would ask this question of you because I think it's interesting considering what we were talking about before we got into the encounters, is that let's say with the 1.12 talents that we think we're going to get straight off the bat with Classic, particularly with an encounter like Patchwork, would this be one of those encounters that would absolutely have to be retuned, given that it's a pretty straightforward tank and spank? And if we went in with the 1.12 talents as opposed to what you had in 1.11 when Naxx first came out, it would then be a bit of a easier task. But I guess most of the guilds still were attempting Naxx with 1.12 talents eventually back in the day. So what do you reckon?
Yeah, I believe it's whatever Blizzard decides they want the game to be like. But if it went in with no changes, I fully believe, pending that the private server experiences I've had were close to authentic, that I feel like it would be steamrolled. They would have to tune it. I know when they originally put out the PTR for Vanilla Naxx, they used Patchwork as the benchmark. They had guilds test that, and they based the effective hit points of tanks as well as the hit points of the bosses based on a lot of those DPS checks. So I believe that they would really have to do something similar, or else I think most guilds who are prepared would steamroll it.
Well, let's move on to Globulus, and I'll go through this quote with user Zapix44 over at Wowhead, who says this. And sorry, I should say, by the way, a lot of the comments that you're about to hear, because I've got a quote for every encounter to read to you before I get to my question, and the vast majority of these quotes are from expansion. So this is not, a classic related quote. It's people going back and tackling it in Wrath of the Lich King and then commenting on Wowhead, which is where a lot of these quotes have come from. So just bear that in mind. But I think a lot of the quotes I pulled out are still relevant to Classic. So this person says this. It's and obviously when they talk about now, they're talking about Wrath of the Lich King. It's ironic that Globulus is now considered one of the hardest bosses in Naxx, when in the vanilla days at level 60, he was considered one of the easiest. So my question for you, Ayle, is that true or false? Did your guild consider Globulus one of the easiest bosses in Naxx?
Yeah, we did. At that point, it was really just kind of managing your poison zones and dispelling. And I definitely feel like Patchwork is way more difficult than Globulus was in vanilla.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that poster.
Okay. Now, I just want to read out a very interesting point that I found, which, I'd love to get your comments on. It's just an interesting tidbit of information as the exact words that they use in their quote. This is from user Pyria over at Wowhead again, who says this. Here's a completely useless tidbit of information about Globulus. When Naxx was first released to level 60, The data-mined mutating injection had a rather more interesting but completely wrong description. In addition to its current effect, it claimed to turn the affected player into an abomination if left to run out. If you think about it, it doesn't make much sense that a mutating injection would just make you fart a poison cloud. This is, of course, conjecture. But it's pretty easy to imagine what happened in the development process. Injection was supposed to be a test to your dispelling as well as your movement. You're forced to dispel it, but doing it early will dump a cloud on your raid, whereas waiting too long will turn the afflicted raid member into a hostile ad. Obviously, Blizzard dropped this version, but whether it was due to difficulty in implementation or difficulty in gameplay is for us to guess and for them to know. So I guess my follow-up question from you is, did you have much trouble with the mutating injections at all? Did you think it was a fun mechanic?
We really didn't have any problem with it. If I remember correctly, we might have actually killed it on our second or third attempt. We assigned one healer to dispel, and then it was pretty straightforward. As far as them not adding that other mechanic, it sounds kind of similar to Chromagus's ability in Blackwing, where if you get all the debuffs stacked, you actually turn into a Draconoid, right? So I could definitely see them having something like that planned, and with them doing that already once in the same game earlier, I'm not sure why they would remove that. That definitely would have added a bit of flair to it.
Let's move on to Gluth, and I'll read you this one from user Ziploc again over at Wowhead, who says this. Killed Gluth last night and noticed a few things to help others out. There was no fear at any point in time. Kiting was made 300% easier with our Holy Paladin doing it and having Hunters and Shaman AoE snare, and the other healers easily keep the tanks up as he doesn't hit hard at all, even considering that we entered the instance this week with tier 6 gear. Again, obviously they're talking about this in Wrath of the Lich King. When you drop from the tube, pick him up and drag him straight ahead at the door, making the distance for the chows to travel to him much longer. Of all the encounters pre-Sapphiron and kel'thuzad, he was the hardest, along with Grobulus, to execute perfectly. So my question is, we've just shot down that Grobulus was difficult. And this was the funny thing when I was pulling all these quotes on. Everyone's got a different take on who was the hardest, who was the easiest. Apparently there were a lot of very easy bosses in Naxx if you go through the forums. And apparently every one of them was also the hardest boss in Naxx. So it's quite hard to really distinguish. But let's talk about what you thought of Gluth. Did you find Gluth particularly difficult to deal with?
Well, the challenge with Gluth, at least for us, because we were on Alliance, is that it relied so much on individual player skill and kiting, where everybody could generally be doing everything right, but if one of your kiters messed up, you'd probably end up dying because the chow would run over and kill a healer and then kill another healer. You'd basically end up with a snowballing situation from that. So we actually struggled a bit with him to consistently kill him from week to week, depending on who we had there kiting. So, for example, if we didn't have the same group of kiters, we'd have to effectively relearn that for the people who were kiting. And I think at the time we were probably using a little bit of a flawed strategy. We were mostly using mages, I believe, with improved Blizzard. And then I can't remember who else, someone else to round it up, but I think that was the main frustration with that fight, is that there were quite a lot of individual skill, and it was something that people had to really do to experience. It was so different from any other fight I can think of, one mistake from somebody and you'd end up wiping. Or if people didn't know the fight, didn't know how to kite, it was tough to kill from week to week. So yeah. I definitely think that post has a little bit of merit where it could be deceptively tough depending on how skilled the people were kiting. Besides that, the tank swaps and everything was fine. The toughest part of that fight is the pipe. I guess you're not too familiar with it, but
I have absolutely zero familiarity with it.
I have a funny story in Classic where sometimes latency wasn't good, and we were going into his room, moving through the pipe, and on the left side of the pipe, there's actually a hole, so you have to stay to the right, or you fall through the hole down into Patrick's room. and we hit a brief lag spike, and our entire raid ended up in the room except for the main tank. And the boss just ran around murdering everybody. And when our main tank got back on, everybody was dead except for him.
Now, let's move on to Thaddeus. And this is a quote from user NeoTMS who says this. This one is, and now they must be talking about the vanilla days, surely. I think this was actually a 1.12 quote, but let's hear it out. This one is basically based on slow compute. Oh, sorry, this was a complaint that they were saying, something they noticed about Thaddeus. And they said, this complaint is basically based on slow computers. During the polarity shift, you'll see the debuff countdown reset, 0:59, and the image will be the same as before, either positive or negative. However, a few seconds after 0:59 ticks, the image buff will be updated, and you may see that you have the opposite buff. This can easily cause a wipe. I've had this happen once or twice, but luckily I haven't had any problems with it for a while. How do you prevent it? Always double check your debuff. Add-ons may help you figure if it bugs, but always keep an eye out on the debuff. Better safe than sorry. So, my question for you, a lot of people are relatively, even if they haven't been through Naxx, relatively familiar with the mechanics of Thaddeus and those polarity shifts. How fun was that to play through? And do you think that people will enjoy going through something like that for the first time if they haven't been through Naxx before?
What do you mean enjoy that?
Well, in terms of, we have things like tank and spanks and, encounters that you can kind of turn your mind off a little bit. Now, my understanding of Thaddeus is this not one of those encounters where you have to separate the raid in two, essentially, and you've got the positives and the negatives on one side of the room and they shift over or something like that?
Yeah, basically, like, everybody's debuff essentially can change at one point, so you have to keep, the positive and negatives apart, and the more of the same, symbol you have in one area, you gain a DPS buff. So it's kind of a fun fight in that regards because, you're pulling big numbers. I remember the difficulty in that in Classic it was actually, like kind of a battle with people's connections, because a lot of times the polarity shifts for whatever reason would cause people to disconnect, or people would just disconnect in general. And I know that caused us a lot of grief. We actually changed our strategy around that to make it so losing, one person to a bad connection or lag wouldn't actually wipe us on the fight. And I'm not sure if other guilds did something similar, but we basically made it so everybody moved every time, where instead of people moving just from east or west, depending on your charges, you would rotate between going east, west, and north, south. So if somebody had disconnected, they would be stuck, say, in the east position. It would be only them. There'd be nobody around them, so they wouldn't, wipe someone of an opposite charge.
So did your guild find this one particularly easy? No troubles whatsoever?
We would have troubles when people had connection issues because, one person could effectively wipe your raid. I wouldn't say he was easy. I would say he was probably kind of like a middle tier, harder boss for Naxx, where like the hardest part of it being like people's connections. And I think like that's one thing that's changed big time from back in the day is that, overall internet connectivity is way better, way more consistent. People are on better computers. I would often, man, it's funny, often on that fight in vanilla, I would have to look at the floor to, lower my frame rate or prevent myself from causing issues, because the way the debuffs were applied or something would just like more often than not boot me.
I've heard this one before. You're not the first caller to talk about having to basically have the character stare at the floor or stare at the corner of a room like the Blair Witch Project because the lag couldn't keep up. That must have been really annoying and something that you had to keep a constant eye on.
Yeah.
So just in regards to Fugan and Stalag, I couldn't really find much on them, but I found this one quote over at Wowhead from user Lazarianus who says this, by far one of the funniest NPCs ever. Fugan make master happy. Did you find these guys just annoying, or what kind of part of the encounter did they play for you?
They weren't really like too difficult. I believe one of them hit really hard. We'd occasionally wipe sometimes on them, but not very frequently. Really, they were pretty easy, like tank and spank. The coolest part about it is that they actually throw the tanks between the platforms, which is kind of whimsical. But yeah, they're kind of just like a preamble to the fight.
That's the construct wing. Any final words on the construct wing in general? Did your guilds, what order did your guild get through the construct wing in? Like, did you tackle it second, third, fourth? How did you generally do it?
I believe we did that one third.
Okay.
Obviously Spiderwing was first.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, I think we did 2 bosses in Plague Wing, and we had troubles with Lothep, so we went into A-bomb wing.
Of all the bosses that we've just gone through so far, any particularly funny stories or anything come to mind, or is it all too long ago?
Really, like, I think the funniest thing was from Bluth, where we lost our tank through the pipe. And like, people would always like fall off the pipe. You know, we'd like, okay, let's get ready to pull. Okay, we're gonna pull, and then someone would fall off the pipe, and, you know, you'd laugh and have to summon them back up and stuff. Like, one of the big battles people don't really talk about in Classic is that, yeah, or some people do mention, is that connections and stuff actually was a really important, like, limiting factor.
Well, let's get on to the next wing, and that's the Plague Wing. So, not the Plague Bringer. And this is from a quote from Zero Anshu Zero, who says this. Yeah, it's nice to know how to kill him, but what everyone wants to know, or at least me, is why does he hate Hygen? Has anyone got an answer? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I won't ask you why he hates Hygen, but let's talk about Noth, and just in terms of, did you find the little the blizzard flare coming through during the encounter a bit fun, or was it just distracting?
No, not really. I think he doesn't like Hygen because Hygen needs a bath, but yeah, it was a fairly easier fight. It can be kind of frustrating to have him teleport up, you know, when he's being like really close to dead and get like another ad wave, for example. Yeah, he was. I guess that being said, he is a little bit of an annoying fight because you really just like DPS him super hard and decurse. And sometimes there are some frustrating moments where, like, you know, he would just teleport up and then, you know, he's at like 2% or something.
Okay, well, let's talk about Hygen the Unclean. And this is from user Atomic, who says, I would say the most important tip for this fight is to not watch other people while doing the dance. Staying with the pack will mean you're actually behind because of lag. Watch and stay ahead of the slime burst and win. Is that a comment that you'd agree with?
Yeah, for Classic, definitely. You know, it was such a shit show with connectivity. I actually kind of learned a better way to do it after doing it again on the private server.
Oh, what was that?
You can actually kind of tell by the way his platform is structured where the ooze is going to burst, right? Because, like, you know, a square has 4 corners. On each side of the corner is where one burst happens, because there's 4 in total. So, yeah, that's kind of something that I figured out, you know, with a good connection, how it's like a lot easier to read. And you definitely shouldn't rely on following anybody else, because their character might be out of sync with, you know, the Blizzard servers and the client or whatever, and it'd be a major issue.
Okay, on to Lower Theb. Now, well, this first stupid again, everyone knows I'm allowed 1 stupid question per interview, maybe 2 if I'm feeling lucky. So here's my first silly question I'm going to burn. What do you say on the pronunciation of this one? Lower Theb or Lotheb?
Oh, Lotheb, for sure.
Okay, all right. I want to make sure I'm on the same page as everyone. All right, because that's what I would have gone with. I would go with Lotheb, but I feel like some people say Lower Theb.
I have a trivia question about Lotheb.
Okay, hit me.
Do you know why he's named Lotheb?
I want to say it's something like an anagram or backwards or what is it?
Hey, I'm giving you full points for that. It's actually an anagram.
Oh, great.
Like
of what? Oh, Healbot. That's right.
Healbot, yeah.
Yes, I do remember reading that somewhere. All right, look at me. I'm not as much of a noob as I thought. All right. Well, on that note, do you think that the cheeky anagram is basically poignant?
Definitely.
Why so?
Well, during that fight, basically, if you're a healer, you could only cast one heal per minute. And so due to that, it's kind of a crazy fight. And I think it's actually my most favorite fight in all of Naxx. Very unique. Healers can only cast one heal per minute. How do you keep your tank and the raid alive not being able to heal effectively?
So how did you?
Well, that's a fight where you basically stack an insane amount of cooldowns and potions. And so I'm not sure if that was ever the really intended way for Blizzard to do it, because the amount of consumables and things required is like really excessive. When you die on that fight, like people cry out in agony because they lose so many potions, so many consumables. Going into that fight, I would be buffed with like a greater nature protection potion. I was a melee character at my most recent time. You'd start pre-buffed with a greater shadow protection potion, and you'd need to have a warlock hellstone and 300 first aid. Because basically, if you were a DPS, you weren't getting heals. The heals were only reserved for the main tank. Like as a DPS or a healer, you had to keep yourself alive through the fight without being able to get any heals.
Very interesting. I must admit, I don't know a lot about Lotheb. I'll have to go look at some more videos of that particular encounter. But all right, well that's the relatively brief Plague Wing. Actually, here's a noob question. Obviously, you know I've never been through Naxxramas. I've never raided in vanilla WoW, so I am like literally the definition of a squeaky clean raiding virgin. Now, when we look at the amount of bosses or encounters in each one of these wings, I see that, Plague Wing only has 3 encounters. Does that mean it took less time to get through, or they were all actually pretty even in time?
Yeah, they were definitely not even. Plague Wing, I think is actually the shortest wing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Not just because it has 3 bosses, but the trash in there is much less. You kind of run through 2 separate gauntlets. After Noth, there's kind of like this gauntlet you run through very quickly. And then after Heigen, there's, another gauntlet that you go through. So like there's a significant, less amount of trash as well as less bosses. It was very quick. Whereas like, other wings, like A-Bomb Wing before Patchwork, there's just like tons of trash. Death Knight Wing, there's a ton of trash. Spider Wing, after the second boss, it's just like 30 minutes of trash.
Okay, well, now that you've mentioned the Spider Wing, that's where we're going next. So when you say, before we get to the encounters, it's something interesting actually to hit on. Let's talk about trash. And you said there's about 30 minutes of trash to go through at one point in the Spider Wing. Throughout the entirety of Naxxramas, talk about the difficulty of the trash. Is it actually something that will take out a mediocre guild in a heartbeat, or is it something that they shouldn't be too worried about?
Yeah, definitely. If you're not on your toes, the trash is very biteable. There's certain mechanics that are very punishing. Some of the earlier A-bombs come to mind in the A-bomb wing. I actually went into Naxx in vanilla with a second guild on my alt, who was kind of it was a much less accomplished guild. I think we ended up only killing 1 boss, and we struggled a lot, even with, like me helping out on their raids. Things like if tanks lose aggro, the mobs run around cleaving everybody, killing them. Cleave was a big thing in vanilla. Some bosses did like AoE shadow, or not bosses, but trash mobs did, AoE shadow bolts that need to be interrupted. So it's like, if players weren't on the ball, using their abilities, you could definitely wipe very easily. And that would happen, and it'd be very frustrating. And it happened, fairly frequently on private servers because, we'd usually be like steamrolling everything so hard, like people kind of wouldn't be paying attention, and then, we wipe.
As we mentioned earlier, Spiderwing is usually where guilds will start. And basically the first encounter then that guilds hit eventually is Anubra Khan. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so I'll read you this quote from user Acritus over at Wowhead again, who says this. This boss is probably the first boss to try during a fresh Naxx run. If the raid knows the tactics, especially the tanks, this boss is rather easy. However, if it's a pug raid and you wipe here, people will leave immediately to not get saved. Now, I do realize that pug raids didn't really happen back in the vanilla days. This is a Wrath of the Lich King comment. Either way, this boss is the newbie's Naxx test. A wipe equals disbanding. So I guess it might be a little bit of hyperbole if I can comment on that one, but did you hear back in the day that yes, like this was the first boss and this was the one that perhaps led to guilds breaking up because a wipe on Anubrakan meant you weren't ready for Naxx, so people went looking elsewhere?
Maybe. Starting out in Naxx, there's a lot of learning to do even for like the introductory bosses as like, this was kind of the top raid, the final raid of vanilla, and everything at that time was, kind of next level. Could it break up guilds if you couldn't kill it? I think so. People were a lot more tolerable then, though, for wiping. I know that I had killed Nubrakan on a PTR, actually with a pug, at that time, in like a few guildies. So it was definitely doable and kind of fairly easy once you get the mechanics down, but that could really be said of any bosses. Like any of the starter bosses. I think actually Patchwork would probably break up more guilds because they wouldn't have, the tanks or healers to do it. And so, some guilds would clear Spider Wing or be able to kill only the first boss in each wing except for Patchwork. And then they would be kind of at a wall. They'd be at like a kind of a gear wall, right? Or a skill wall.
All right. Well, let's move on to, what is still arguably one of my favorite boss names in the game, Grand Widow Phaelina. And I'll read you what is a relatively lengthy quote from Odin over at Wowhead, who says this. Timing is crucial in this fight. If the Naxxramas cultists are sacrificed before Grand Widow Phaelina enrages, she will not enrage for approximately 30 seconds after the cultist is sacrificed. If the cultist is sacrificed after Grand Widow Phaelina enrages, she will not enrage for approximately 60 seconds, and her poison bolt volley will also be silenced for approximately 30 seconds. In terms of the learning curve, although it can take more attempts to get used to the timing, sacrificing the cultist just after Grand Widow Phaelina has enraged gives the raid a lot more time. As it is such a quick, DPS-intensive encounter, this can be very important. Greater fire protection potions and greater nature protection potions are also crucial, as DPS classes do not have the time to step out and bandage themselves during this encounter, nor can they effectively heal themselves such that they can mitigate the incoming damage, since where the fire is avoidable, poison is not. So, my question for you is, Grand Widow Phaelina, is she as complicated as that quote makes her seem?
We didn't really have any troubles with her. Once we had her on farm, I don't believe we even used protection potions. We were essentially able to move out or heal through all the damage. The timing is important. You do have to do the mechanic correctly or you will wipe, because it actually kind of like prevents an enrage from her. From like, your tank would have to basically put up shield wall or would be dead. And she wasn't tauntable, so that would basically mean her running around killing your raid. So while you had to do the mechanics correctly, I still believe she was one of the easier fights in Naxx.
Are you with me just very quickly on a slight tangent? When I say that she has one of my favorite boss names in the game, how do you feel about that? Is she up there for you, or do you have what would be your top few boss names off the top of your head? Sorry to put you on the spot like this.
Well, is that only your favorite because there's so many dangerous spiders where you are, like Black Widow, maybe?
No, it's not the
Down Under the so dangerous Widowmaker. Death animals.
That's right. Yeah, the constant fear that Australians live in from death by 8 legs. No, it's I just think it sounds really cool. But there's obviously.
No, I agree with you. It's neat. It's kind of a name that it almost tells a story, right? Like,
Yeah.
she's someone of high esteem and she's a widow, right? Like, I feel like there could be some more backstory there.
Up there for me as well is General Rageax. I don't know why. I just think it's cool.
That was pretty cool.
And I think the big one, you go again, Velistraz the Corrupt. That's pretty awesome as well.
I think personally that that's my favorite.
Yeah.
Raz.
Once you get a title, I think you're up there in the cool name list. But all right, we'll move along. Let's talk about now again, I'm going to hit you with everyone knows I'm a weird stickler for pronunciation, and I get a lot of pronunciations wrong in the game that, whether it's an accent thing or something else, people get up in arms. But let's talk about this one. Naxxramas, what do you go with?
Oh man. Well, Canadian accent might be totally different, but, I go with, Naxxramas.
That's what I go with. All right. Good man. Let's kick on. So, Naxxramas.
But, we might just be distinguished gentlemen, so.
That's true. That's true. You never know. Don't worry. I'll find something else to pronounce like absolute gutter mouth, and you'll be like, Josh, I'll take back that distinguished comment now. But we'll take you to
I'll just end the call.
Exactly. I'll just hear a beep, beep, beep. Now, TK0680 over at Wowhead says this about Naxxramas. I can't emphasize the importance of removing necrotic poison enough. A 75% or 90% reduction in all healing received will be devastating to any tank, particularly when a healer gets wrapped or during a web spray. It should be a no-brainer, but make sure your dispel-capable classes are aware of their duties. And don't just assume that it's a mild dot poison that they can leave alone. If your shaman claims they have a more important water totem to use, slap them hard. Now, do you agree with that comment?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like pretty much the only way you can wipe before her, like, soften rage. Same thing, like, I believe in classic, druids have a poison dispel that ticks every few seconds. So, like, honestly, in that case, like, just double up. Because, like, if the tank gets that ability on it, Naxxramas actually hits quite hard. And not being able to get the heals through to your tank would be, a sure wipe.
I'm going to burn my second lifeline here and ask my second stupid question of the podcast. And this is, again, everyone knows the alternate title of this podcast is The Education of Josh Corbett, because I know next to nothing about World of Warcraft. But, and obviously in saying that, I talk about in terms of veterans, I still like to jokingly refer to myself as the king of the casuals, because I know more than most casuals, but I don't know as much as veterans. So, when we talk about dispelling, this is something that I've always wondered about, because I've only got experience with rogues. We obviously have absolutely nothing to do with this whatsoever, but you've leveled many classes to cap. With dispelling, I'm planning on playing a priest in Classic. How many encounters in the game do I seriously have to be on the ball with dispelling?
Oh man, lots. Well, are you planning on playing Horde or Alliance?
I'll be playing Horde.
Okay, even more.
Okay.
Because the good thing about Alliance is that Paladins can dispel magic as well. Where on Horde, priests are the only ones. Shaman can't do it, actually. And so because of that, I believe priests have abolish poison and dispel magic. And yeah, it's up to priests. So how many fights? I would say probably about 25% of fights, maybe. That might be a little high, but there's a pretty good amount of fights in an instance where, you need to be dispelling as well as healing.
Right. So I've got twice as many reasons now for my guild to get upset with me when I'm not healing and not dispelling.
Right. But maybe you could convince them to be shadow.
Well,
they would probably still make you dispel anyways.
That's the plan. I'm going to give healing a really good go. I want to try it, but if it's just not me, I'm going to have to convince people to allow me to play shadow, basically.
Yeah. Even most hardcore guilds, well, yeah, they would take at least one shadow, but I think most guilds would take at least one shadow for raiding. I'm
hoping whoever I play with will make an exception for a poor, lowly podcaster, but we shall see.
Yeah. You would probably still have to dispel the shadow, though, so.
Absolutely. And they'll say, we don't care if you're an Australian in your podcast. No exceptions. So here we go. I'll get into the Death Knight wing, and we'll start with Instructor Resuvius. And this quote from Canna Lehman over at Wowhead says this. And again, you'll see a common theme here. This is the easiest boss in Naxxramas. This fight requires your priests to be on the ball with mind control, and they must have +2 or +3% hit with spells to do this smoothly. Resuvius hits too hard for a player to tank him, so you must keep an understudy mind controlled at all times to tank him. Melee can stay in and DPS, and the entire fight and range DPS make sure to get out of the disrupting shout so you can stay alive. So, my question is, once again, we hear a boss being described as the easiest boss in Naxxramas. What do you think of Resuvius?
Yeah, I would say he's either the easiest or the second easiest. Him and Anubrakan are definitely pretty bottom tier. The first boss in each of the wings except for Patchwork were quite easy, so they're probably the bottom three. People's order might differ depending on how good of people they're playing with, because one of the challenges with that fight is that your priests need to be on the ball. So depending on how that was and if they were properly geared, that would kind of be the challenges, as well as your DPS pulling aggro. And then if you had those things under control, it was a pretty easy fight.
Let's go on to Gothic the Harvester, and Sergeant Nimrod says this. Really, this is a tough fight if your DPS is unbalanced, but it's very doable if enough people survive the chaos. We managed to cheese it a bit, but I'm sure that any guild can pull a few tricks and defeat this boss. So, my question to you, Ayle, is, in terms of cheesing a little bit, did you find that you could play some tricks with Gothic the Harvester? And were there any other bosses in Naxx you could kind of fuck around with the mechanics a little bit and beat the system?
Sorry, how did the poster say they cheesed?
Well, that's the problem. They didn't, so I don't know what they're talking about, and I was hoping you might know.
Yeah, I'm not too sure exactly what they might be
appreciate they're probably talking about Wrath. Okay.
Yeah, well, Wrath was a totally different fight. I know for us, we had much more caster DPS in Classic, so it was pretty difficult, especially because a lot of our warriors were tank spec. And that's often what we'd struggle with, is that the casters would get too far ahead of the melee and end up wiping them. Because you do have to remain in perfect balance. Every mob you kill on the living side, which is the left side, they would effectively die, get harvested, and move over to the dead side, which the melee would have to kill on the right. So if your casters were too fast, they would get overrun. If they were too slow, the casters would get overrun. But we usually never had that problem. We would usually end up overloading our melee side.
Let's get to one of the big ones, the Four Horsemen. We're talking about, of course, the infamous High Lord Mograine. Or do you say, okay, again, well, let's do the pronunciation thing. Do you say Mograine or Mograine? I want to say Mograine.
Mo.
You go with Mo.
Mo, yeah.
All
Mo
right.
better.
The kid, bring out the Mo. All right. Mograine. Thane Korthaz. And I'm going to get you to pronounce this one because I know how it's supposed to be said. How do you pronounce the lady's name?
Oh, man. I think this is like a personal preference. But I say Blamo.
Oh, you're killing me. Come on.
I know it's French and it's like
Blamo. Blamo.
Yeah. But when I see it, I just see like Blamo.
Blamo.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Lady Blamo and Sir Zeliek. So I'm going to read you a relatively long post because obviously the Four Horsemen, one of the more infamous encounters in the game. It's a relatively important one for people to hear about. So
yeah. If anyone deserved a long post, it would be Four Horsemen.
Absolutely. So let's not be shy. If you want to let's devote a bit of time to this one. And this is from a topic over at MMO Champion titled Four Horsemen Discussion, Why Was It Hard? And the quote reads as follows from Garachasa, who says this. To those that don't know, Four Horsemen was arguably the most difficult fight Warcraft ever had. It went unbeaten for months, and the level of coordination required at the time was absurd. However, the fight was never nerfed, which is why it kind of holds a special place in WoW lore. However, I never came close to rating it myself, but have heard very conflicting reasons as to why the fight was hard. Some say it was because you had to poach warriors with the 4-piece dreadnought bonus, as back then taunt was a spell, and spell hit and melee hit were two different stats, and warriors didn't wear spell hit gear, and spells had I think it was 9 or 17% chance to miss. That bears repeating. Back in vanilla, taunt could miss. However, the reason I think this encounter was tough was because the fight was tuned so tightly and running extra tanks wasn't a viable option. But again, it's tough to filter out all the noise on the internet because half of the people say you had to have X amount of tanks, but the other half say that half was stupid and that only half of those tanks or 2 times those tanks were needed. So basically we can't decide on how many tanks we needed. I've also heard that for months people didn't realize there could be a safe zone in the center, but that just doesn't seem that likely, as it's very simple geometry that dictates that if 4 circles are fit into the corners of a square, there might be an opening in the center. One thing I do know is that there was a bug for some players on some pools where the black void zone spawned by Blamo or Blammo or whoever weren't or wasn't always visible. So the question is, why was the fight hard, and what mechanics actually caused the wipes? Was it soaking the meteor, the taunt resist, the length of the fight, going out of mana, or just people screwing up their positioning? Alright, that's the end of that long post. So obviously they ended it with a fair few questions there, but let's just start with that. What was the deal with 4 Horsemen? Why was this such an iconic fight and so difficult?
The reason why it was so challenging was really all of those reasons. All of those reasons led to wipes, and often at the same time. The fight was very long. It required, at least for us at the time, we did it with like a large amount of tanks. I think we had 8, and I don't believe we had a warrior always tanking Zelik in the back. You get away with it with like a hunter or something. It was based on proximity, but we had an extra tanks just in case there was taunt failures, right? With an 8% chance to fail, without your 4-piece bonus, and the reel, which we didn't know about or use at the time. There's a very good likelihood that a taunt would fail, I think 1 in every 3 or 4 rotations. And that was very challenging. We needed players on the ball when there's a taunt resist, the backup warrior to get in there. And the bosses had a mechanic in which they shield walled at certain percent hit points. So I think it was 50% and 25%. So it made it so you couldn't zerg one boss down and kill it really fast. Otherwise, groups would stack all their DPS on one boss and just kill it, and then, effectively they don't really have to go back to it. So because everything had to be kind of spread out and balance the DPS down equally, you would run into healer problems. People would maybe rotate incorrectly, eat an extra mark, and die. In the end, it was just a very complex fight geometrically, as well as a very technical fight, and then sprinkle in some, hate to say it, shitty mechanic of taunt being spell resisted, and it was just a really steep learning curve and a long amount of time. I believe it took our guild 4 weeks to down 4 horsemen, and that is with doing probably 8 to 10 hours of attempts per week, practicing, working on things, trying to get better, and getting more warriors. What were a couple of the other reasons he mentioned besides attrition and the rotation and the taunt resist?
So he mentioned was it soaking the meteor? I don't know what that means. Does that mean something to you, I'm presuming?
Yeah, it does. Thane Korthaz basically has a meteor ability. There's a few other mobs in vanilla that had that as well. I think some in AQ, where he drops a meteor on the main tank who's tanking at the time, and it deals, I think, a high amount of damage, say 30,000 damage. But this damage is split in everybody around the tank in about 3 to 5 meters. So if the tank is by himself, he takes 30k, he dies. If there's 2 people there, they each take 15k, they both die. right? There's 3 people there. They each take 10k. Tank might live depending on his hit points. Other 2 people die. So you would need to have 4 to 6 people there to soak that meteor, or else when he did that, it would just die. And so because there was 4 bosses and you had your entire raid rotating all the time, there would often be problems where people would screw up the rotation. There wasn't enough people on Thane to eat the meteor. He'd meteor, wipe that entire side, and then you have Thane running around just meteoring at will, right? They didn't have the mechanic they added in Wrath. In Wrath, they made it way easier. When you pull the bosses, they all run to their corners and stay there. Where in Classic, that didn't happen. You could pull the bosses wherever you wanted them to go, basically. The meteor would definitely eat people alive if you didn't have your rotation done correctly.
When you say 4 to 6 people would probably be required there to help soak up that 30k, are you talking about 4 to 6 tanks or just 4 to 6 raid members?
Just other players. And so like the number I give on that isn't exact. I don't remember the exact amount, but I remember there would have to be, I think, more than 3 people there, because the damage would be split between all the people.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's why I'm just doing a bit of light number crunching, and I'm not calling out your maths in any way.
The
but
math
that's why
is
I asked about,
definitely wrong. Yeah.
That's why I asked about tanks, because I was like, well, hang on, if there's 6 people soaking up 30k, they're taking 5k damage each, and how much HP did any class other than a tank have in vanilla? Wasn't it much less than 5k? I've got no idea. I can't.
Yeah,
think of it.
it usually wasn't much more than 5k. The other classes, I think Warlocks had more, like maybe 7 or 8.
Okay.
Hunters might have had a little bit more, but usually when you rotated into that corner, you'd pop a fire resist potion, which would give you like 2200 to 3200 extra absorb. So you'd pop your potion, go into the corner, you'd wait till the other group was ready to rotate in, and then you'd rotate out.
I've got no idea what kind of health pools classes wound up with after they slapped on all their AQ40 gear, so I couldn't give an estimation or anything.
Yeah, it was pretty much like tanks had around 10k. The average is about 5k. Some classes were up to 7, so between 5 and 10k.
Okay. So the other thing that was interesting was the point they said was also possibly another reason for a wipe on 4 Horsemen was going out of mana. And I presume this is strictly just due to the length of the fight.
Yeah, so actually, each of the 4 Horsemen has a dot ability they cast every certain amount of time. I don't have the exact numbers on it, but the effect of the dot is it's applied in a circle around the boss, say like 20 or 30 yards. And if you're in that circle, the mark is applied to you. And every time that same mark is applied to you, the damage is doubled, right? So eventually it gets to a point where you can't eat another mark, and that's why you have to rotate out from that zone around that boss, right? So, you start on, say, Thane. He puts on a mark at Thane. I think the first one deals maybe 750. Second mark, 1500. Third mark, 3k. You're going to have to rotate out after third mark. You hit a fourth mark, it would kill most people. Each of those bosses are doing the same thing at the same time as well. They're each applying their own mark. So, every so often, the entire raid has to rotate to a different one so they can start eating different marks.
All right, I'm going to hit you with another quote about the 4 Horsemen. This kind of pushes you a little bit on what we've just said. And keep in mind that this comment, I think people might disagree with, but we'll see. This is from Scoop over at Reddit, who says this. 4 Horsemen is overrated. The reason it took, overrated. I'm not sure if that sounded like overrated. Overrated. The reason it took so long for the first guild to kill it was that no one thought Blizzard would actually expect you to use 8 tanks. So they tried every possible other solution before that. Once the 8 tank strategy came out, a lot of guilds killed it pretty quickly. Now, I'm not 100% sure about that kind of statement, whether it's a bit hyperbolic, but what do you have to say to people that say, no. Once you got the 8 tank thing down, you just watch the video and it's a piece of piss?
No, you still need to understand the rotations and be like geared enough to be able to do it. When we were doing it on Chronos, we actually practiced that extensively before playing the fight. It was almost like a dance recital because we'd go in the room before him, we'd split everybody up into four corners, and we'd be like, rotate, na, 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 everybody would move. And then, we'd count out 3 marks. Okay, rotate. Na, 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 and then everybody would move again. So I believe that guilds probably killed it shortly after finding out 8 tanks was the easiest way to do it because so many guilds had been banging their head against the wall trying to kill it, but doing it with the wrong strategy. So ones that understood the rotation were probably able to kill it relatively quickly. But I know for my guilds, taking a month to kill it, probably with a couple weeks of knowing the right strategy even, the fight is just that complex with that many random factors. I was actually talking to Grash again about Horseman before this, and he said that he remembered that for us in our guild, that was actually might have been our most exciting boss kill, just because it took us so long to down him. And he was one of the really big guild breakers because guilds that were pretty good but just not quite good enough would get stuck on him, and then tanks would leave for other guilds and basically make their entire raid group not able to do it.
So that was the moment when everyone's ears started bleeding because of the screaming in Ventrilo, like, yeah!
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. Well, just one last point on this, and it's something that you've raised because you've talked about the extensive testing you did on the PTRs back in the day. And, obviously as a hardcore raiding guild, you're pushing yourselves, as far as you could, and you wanted to get through the content. Do you miss the days of obviously back in vanilla when you didn't know what these encounters would bring? And we talk about, so many years later, people who haven't even done these encounters know the mechanics because we've got all the videos, we've got all the information. And obviously we still have retail World of Warcraft bringing out even new raids this week in Battle for Azeroth where people are going to have to learn the encounters and they've gone through the PTRs and all that jazz and it's all uncharted territory. Do you miss those days back in vanilla when you were everything was new? You were playing this amazing MMO called World of Warcraft that was the new kid on the block and they had, for what was the time, absolutely just groundbreaking encounters in these raids.
Oh, definitely. There's nothing like the first time. I know like that, some guilds would get to attempt them on PTRs, so there was a little bit of information out there. And, some of the really ahead of the curve guilds would down them before other guilds and release some videos. But yeah, definitely that people can have all this information prior to going in is, it is going to not be as, as shiny as it might have been.
The listeners will have to excuse my super sleazy laugh when you say there's nothing like the first time, and I'm sitting here going, Anyway, moving right along, let's get to the Frostworm Lair and Sapphiron. And I'll read you this quote from user Kators, who says this: Sapphiron was the single coolest, pun not intended, boss in Naxxramas. As it seems, the ice blocks behind which you have to hide from the devastating ability, the Frost Breath, is a bit bugged. So to be completely sure that you're in the right position when he casts Frost Breath, try attacking him from behind the ice block. If it says target not in the line of sight, then you're safe. Other than that, stay out of the blizzards and use your mana rationally and you should be fine. Now, I find, tell me if you disagree with this, that Sapphiron, despite being what for all intents and purposes is the penultimate boss in the game, it's second last, it's got to be surely right up there in players' memories or revered. I think that people don't talk about Sapphiron a lot. Do you find that?
I think so, which is really too bad. I think just because most people would do Four Horsemen last before going to Frostworm Lair, and it would take longer to kill Four Horsemen, I think that it kind of overshadows a bit, especially just where it's positioned between, kel'thuzad and the Four Horsemen. It's definitely a little bit like the middle child.
The red-headed stepchild of Naxxramas.
I didn't want to go that far, but yeah.
So I didn't know. You just mentioned something. Can you do? Sorry. So you don't have to do Sapphiron second last or anything like that. You can do it a little bit out of order, can you?
No, you can't. Not in Classic. In Wrath, I believe you can. Like,
I see.
I think like actually right now we're in here and I can see we can go up there. But in Classic, you had to clear all the other wings.
That's what I thought.
It was signified by these giant kind of lizard eyes that are in the 4 different wings. And once those were like turned on, it would open up the Frostrum layer to be able to go in. So yeah, he had to be done second last. You needed to have all other 4 wings cleared to be able to get in there.
Did you have any great sense of triumph when you downed Sapphiron for the first time? Were there anything that gave your guild troubles or any memorable stories?
Yeah, Sapphiron is a huge gear check for frost resistance. He has a pulsing aura that deals a huge amount of frost resistance, and the majority of your raid needs to be, I think as close to, I don't remember the exact breakpoint, but I think maybe 280 to get 75% frost resistance. And besides that, the pieces that aren't frost resistance need to be like close to best in slot or for your healers. And your tank actually needs to be Metal Gear too, or else it's like it's a very difficult fight. By that point, a lot of guilds had struggled so far on 4 Horsemen that if you could get past 4 Horsemen, you would definitely probably be able to kill Sapphiron within a couple of weeks.
Let's get to the big bad, that last dude that everyone wants to gun for when Classic comes around. The big cheese. Sorry, go for it.
One other thing I wanted to touch on is you talked about buggy ice blocks.
Yep.
And that was definitely a problem where people would thought they're behind the ice block, they're not. He has a insta kill mechanic where if you're not behind the ice block and he does his like frost breath, it kills you like one shot. So there was often times where people thought they're behind blocks, not behind blocks, they died. Or the block would appear, but it actually like wouldn't be there, and then people would die because they weren't, properly hidden. So we definitely ran into some bugginess on that encounter.
Alrighty. Well, without any further ado, sorry, you got one more?
Yeah, one more.
Go for it.
I think if I remember correctly, the reason for that is that the Frostworm layer was never actually on the PTR. So a lot of people said, blame Blizzard that the fights weren't tested well enough. And, that's why there's bugginess on these encounters.
Okay. Now, before I get to KT, anything else on Sapphiron?
No, I think that's all for Ron.
You did. I'm teasing, of course, naturally. You did very well. And let's get into, as I said, the big cheese, KT. This is obviously, when we play video games, we really do have a fixation with the final boss. When we start games, I've been playing games my whole life. I remember, going through things like Castlevania, Mega Man as a 6-year-old back in the day, playing on my Nintendo. And you knew, you found out who the last boss was, either through talking with friends or reading magazines. And it was something to strive for. It's like, I want to get there one day. I want to beat the game because I want to see all of the content. And here we are with kel'thuzad. And it's a strange situation when we talk about something that is so famous within the player base, yet almost no one has actually seen. So just keeping that in mind, I'll ask you about the following post from user Forest Eye, who says this. kel'thuzad was probably the hardest boss in Naxxramas, yes. The fight is comprised of mechanics that require every person in the raid to be aware of multiple things that can kill them. There is no way to save someone on KT if they are not paying attention. So, my question for you, we've just spoken a lot about the 4 Horsemen, and you've just given a very elaborate number of reasons why the 4 Horsemen was a real headache and a pain in the ass. Is kel'thuzad the hardest boss in Naxxramas?
Yes, I believe so. And what that poster says is totally true. there is no forgiveness on kel'thuzad. The mechanics, you have a short amount of time to react, and if you do it wrong, it kills you, right? That it's as simple as that, while at the same time being a huge, kind of healer in DPS check.
Okay.
And based on that, a lot of people say Four Horsemen they believe to be the toughest, but I think that's just because a lot of people couldn't get past it. There wasn't enough people to actually see kel'thuzad to see how tough he was.
Well, that's a great point, and you've actually predicted my next question was, do you think that because when I was Googling around looking for this, I was like, all right, I'm sure there's a million posts out there talking about how amazingly difficult kel'thuzad was, and it was really hard to find things talking about, people's experiences with the KT encounter. And then it sort of, the penny dropped for me where I was like, oh yeah, it makes perfect sense. People aren't writing about it online because not that many fucking people got to do it. Is that why kel'thuzad isn't why we hear so much more about, oh my God, the Four Horsemen are so hard, and we just don't hear that about KT for that reason?
I think that has a lot to do with it. Alrighty.
Now, how did it feel? Just explain the moment when your guild, the first time you downed what I guess probably we knew at the time because we knew that Burning Crusade was coming out, what you knew to be the last boss of vanilla World of Warcraft.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm presuming that by the time you downed kel'thuzad, I think we knew about the Burning Crusade by then. I'm trying to remember exactly when BC was announced. Because I know that we got Naxxramas 7 months before BC came out, but the announcement was months beforehand. So I'm just wondering, can you remember when you downed KT, did you know that BC was coming? And so in that frame of mind, how did it feel to down what you would have known to be the last boss of vanilla World of Warcraft?
Yeah, it was, it was obviously a very exciting moment, and I think kind of bittersweet knowing that. I can't remember the exact date when they announced TBC, but they did have a very public beta. And so knowing that there was major changes coming to the game, reducing the raid size to 25, there was a lot of uncertainty at that time. And I know for a lot of people, some guilds even actually stopped raiding because they're like, oh, there's no point continuing on. Do you see what kind of loot drops in TBC, and it totally outscales this, and why are we even bothering to spend all this time doing this, right? But for us, it was a really important goal for us to actually finish it, right? To actually get through it all. I think our first kill was really through the skin of our teeth. I think one of the off tanks died, and the new Rubians are running around killing people, and half the raid's dead, and we just finally managed to get the last few hit points. Everybody erupted and cheering. It sounds like a really yeah, that happened thing, but you'd end up spending so much time on these fights and, playing with these people that actually finishing something that you spent work weeks on was, an amazing feeling.
I can only imagine, and I'm sure that many of us can only hope to get to feel that as you did back in the day when Classic drops. Now, that's all the encounters in the game, and what I want to just kind of clean up with was just a few sort of generic notes about Naxx, and we haven't really touched on it, but we can just gloss over it. In terms of the loot of Naxxramas, do you have any personal favorite pieces of gear that you really, really hope for when you go through the place? I mean, obviously you got your tier sets and things like that, but is there one particular or two particular items you're like, I fucking love that thing?
Well, generally the tier sets were amazingly itemized. They all had really good skins. Those are sweet. Everybody loved those. As far as a few specific items, obviously ATS, the Staff of the Guardian comes to mind, being the last legendary item in Classic, it being very, very difficult to get. It had a unique ability. It was just the best staff in the game. That's something that was incredible. And then the other one that I can think of is the Corrupted Ashbringer.
Of course.
There was a very, very small chance for it to drop off of the Four Horsemen. And from what I can remember, I don't know how accurate it is. It's one of the few items that actually give you negative stats. It had negative 20 stamina, if I remember correctly. And with it there was kind of a bunch of Easter eggs that for players who got it. Things like you could go into Scarlet Monastery and they wouldn't attack you. They would all like whisper about the weapon, and you could go see Mulgrain. I believe it was his son in Scarlet Monastery, and there'd be like kind of like an RP special event. Basically, there was like a bunch of hidden Easter eggs when you actually had the sword that were like incredibly cool. So it'd be like that sword or ATS, I'd say, or like the two that I would pick.
Did you ever see Corrupted Ashbringer drop?
We never saw the Corrupted Ashbringer drop in our guild, unfortunately. Okay. But I do have a cool story about ATS.
Yeah, go for it.
We had completed, I think, two or three ATS by the time TBC had came around. But on the last night, before TBC had launched, we had actually cleared through Naxx again and got to kel'thuzad. Now, our guild at the time, on Melganus Validus, we had I'd said earlier, a combination of a bunch of guilds that had kind of collapsed and formed. And at this time on Melganus, I would say we were kind of like we were a lower tier, high-end raiding guild. Like, we ended up clearing the whole way, but there were two guilds who were better than us on the server who cleared faster. And those guilds were, frankly, kind of elitist jerks. No, elitist jerks were cool. They were on the server on the Horde. But the two alliance guilds were a little bit elitist, and there were players from other guilds who had managed to collect all of the prerequisites to get the staff. But unfortunately, in order to have the staff completed, you had to kill kel'thuzad, and these guilds didn't get that far. All you needed was you got the quest when you zone into the instance, and then you had to loot, I think, 40 splinters from bosses. So a lot of guilds were able to kill enough bosses to get the splinters and then kill Cthulhu. But they couldn't get kel'thuzad. So our last night before, we had cleared the kel'thuzad, and we actually teamed up with 3 other players who just needed that kill to get their staff. And we were able to kill him. I remember it was, for whatever reason, our most, I think, challenging kill. I think we had a lot of people who weren't playing. We had a lot of spares and stuff fill in. A lot of people hadn't done it before. And we were able to get the kill for those 3 guys. And like, that felt really great. And it was kind of like a representation of what the community could be like back then. Like, we were like this, pretty top tier raiding guild, but we helped out our fellow server compatriots who, couldn't quite get there. And I think that was something really special that we did.
Okay. Now, in terms of, just to clean up on loot, what other things can obviously people look forward to in terms of, whether it's by way of trash or encounters? Like, is there a particular, what you've got now? You've been in a situation when you pretty much, had Naxx on farm in a way. Crafting materials, things like that. Did you have professions that you loved to head to Naxx for because there was such great money makers or anything like that? Well,
Naxx being on farm in Classic, I never really felt we actually had it on farm, because any of the there was a big number of the fights where we would continue to wipe on because, there was such a slim margin for error. So I never actually really felt comfortable with it like we did with other raids, which is, I felt like was unique at the time. But like, as far as professions go, like I said, you need to have max level first aid. A gathering profession, herbalism and alchemy is really good because you need a ton of potions. That was my profession during Classic, so I made flasks and all the required potions. That's really essential to have someone in your guild that can do that. As far as for other professions go, I think it helps to have engineering as DPS class. There's a couple tricks you can do. For example, you can have a battle chicken. It can give you a 5% haste buff. That can be helpful. Not really required. I'm trying to think of any of the other professions are that important. I believe you need the other professions to actually craft the tier sets, which was something different. Each tier piece required a set of turn-ins as well as a drop that required all the upper kind of like trade skill items. So like, for example, the like plate set would require Arcanite bars. And that would have to be transmuted by an alchemist. And it was the same with the leather set. They required, I can't remember the kind of leather, but like it takes a salt shaker and it's like a 24-hour cooldown. They needed that special kind of leather, right? So you needed to have somebody to create those crafted mats for you to like get your tier set, which was kind of different.
Do you remember any drama or massive fights over any particular drops in Naxx?
Oh man. Drax was drama llama, man. Like so many things happened. Like usually the decision of who got ATS first caused lots of issues in guilds. Basically, like, some people would, choose to give it to themselves over someone who was more dedicated, and that would cause all sorts of drama. Kind of the order of that really mattered a lot. I know that was a big reason for some people actually leaving and joining our guild, is that they felt they were more deserving for a certain item than somebody else who played less. Pretty much everything in here is like best in slot, so there was tons of that. I know there was a rogue, for example, who left because I think there was a dagger off my Naxxramas, I believe, or maybe a sword, I can't remember. And he believed he should have been up for this. Another rogue was a different specialization, weapon specialization. The dagger, we'll say, dropped. It should have went to him, and the other guy took it, right? So he leaves, that kind of thing. So I feel like that was common on our server. Our server was very high pop, and there were like, a few options for people who were higher in for that to happen. So I think some people felt because it was kind of the end of the expansion, they would kind of like get away with some stuff in that regards. But yeah, there was quite a bit of loot drama actually throughout the whole classic vanilla, because it was really like kind of the first MMO for a lot of people. So like just the way loot was handled and how to do things, it was almost like a social experiment.
I think that's a great way to put it. Absolutely. Now, just sort of rounding off the chat here about Naxx, and I've got two final questions for you. And the second last one is this. Starts with a quote from user Steak and Cheese Versus over at Reddit, who says this: when less than 1% of the player population actually successfully killed the first mob pool in Naxx, yet somehow 99% of players cleared it. And so my question to you is actually a listener question from listener of the show, Seven Winters, who says this: Ayle, how does it make you feel that everyone and their mother on the internet claims to have killed KT during vanilla when they probably never set foot in Naxx?
I mean, honestly, that doesn't bother me because I know what I did. I know what our guild did, and I'm really proud of it. And it was so rare to kill KT that I feel like it almost became a legend. And people who maybe played at that time, they wanted to be a part of that kind of classic legend, even if it means lying about it, right? And, so I think that's like a big part of it. It's also possible that like people went in there at 70 or, 80 and even done it. But yeah, overall, it doesn't matter. Like, I know what we accomplished, and, that's good enough for me.
Fantastic. Now, the last question for you, and you've done so well through obviously.
Also,
yeah, no, go for it.
I have irrefutable proof, so come at me, bros.
And what's the proof that you're sitting on?
Well, I still have my tier sets that I haven't put in the void storage. They have the original enchants. That isn't 100% irrefutable because, people could say I got it at 70 or whatever, but I actually have a friend who never leveled his characters after Naxx, and he has KT drops on them that are not attainable through the black market auction house. So that's pretty much it right there.
Very nice. And you know what? I've just realized, I'm not sure if we've even mentioned, and people might be absolutely jumping up and down now. What was the name of your guild back in the day?
Our final guild we cleared Naxx with was Validus.
Sorry, Validus. Sorry, you have mentioned that name a fair few times during it. I wasn't I wasn't triggering.
A couple times.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah. We were a conglomerate of like 3 or 4 different like raid guilds at the time, like Silent Requiem, Miss Fury, and LOH, and I think even like Advent. Basically, like a large group of raiders came together to kind of form this like X-Force team.
Absolutely. Now, last question, and this is from Countdown to Classic listener Hellbop, who asked this. Given that Classic will likely not receive an expansion just months following the release of Naxxramas, as it did in the vanilla days, do you think that the raid should be scaled down? My question can be aimed at the loot tables in particular. I recall in the weeks before the Burning Crusade that raiders with enough Naxx gear could face roll most of the high-level content. I've also noticed this to be true on some private servers, and it's something I worry about reducing the longevity of Classic. So, I'm going to pile on top of that listener question and sort of sum it up with this one, and we'll end the Naxx chat with this. Do you want any changes to Naxxramas, or is it fine just as it is?
For the most part of the overall game, I don't really want any changes. But as far as it comes to Naxx and the encounters, I would like them to tune it for it to be difficult.
Oh, don't say it. Don't say it.
I know I'm not going to be popular for that. I feel like it should be tuned a little bit, because I think if it's as easy as what happens on the private servers, I'm hoping they have it all wrong, and it's as hard as we remember. But yeah, as far as Naxx goes, I think it could be, they could have a classic experience without changing too many things. The first part of his question, talking about raid gear, I think that would be a major problem for vanilla. Like, once the server has been out for a while and everybody's running around in Naxx gear, like, I remember having at the end of Naxx, really, really good gear, and I would essentially 2-shot or 1-shot if I crit, most other players. Like, my fireballs were 2K, right? So, when everybody's running around and stuff like that, like for PvP, things would be like incredibly unbalanced. I know it was a major issue because TBC, they basically doubled all stamina on all items, like right out of the game. And that helped to alleviate some things. But yeah, that would be a major concern for people. Like, once Naxx is cleared, there isn't really a plan for after that. It was TBC, so, they would maybe have to make TBC. Or, people might be happy. But overall, I'm on the, overall no changes, but I would be okay if they tuned Naxx slightly.
Ayle, you're killing me. Think of the little guy. Think of the noobs like me. We can't handle it. Come on.
Oh, even you would be so much better.
All right, with all that Naxx chat out of the way, now it's time for anger management. Each episode, I ask the interviewee to hit me with some of their angriest thoughts about World of Warcraft vanilla, or World of Warcraft in general. So, Ayle, hit me. What's something or some things that absolutely piss you off about World of Warcraft?
Oh man, I definitely Naxx special one at the top of that list is tank taunt resist on 4 horsemen. You'll be cruising along just fine, and you'll have a taunt resist, and you'll wipe after, being in there for maybe like 10 minutes on the encounter. Just so much waste for like a really poorly designed mechanic.
Excellent. Now, have there been a few moments where you've almost thrown the headset through the screen on a wipe on the 4 horsemen because of that?
Oh man, I would slap the shit out of my old CRT monitor.
Excellent. All right. Well, now that you've got that anger out of your system, how about we calm things down a little bit and we'll head along with some memory lane. Each episode, I ask the interviewee to hit me with one of their fondest or funniest memories from back in the vanilla days. So, Ayle, I'll ask you, do you have a story that you find particularly funny that you'd like to tell the listeners, or something that was just a really fond or happy memory?
Yeah, I have a couple. The first one, which is like Naxx themed, is we had a new tank on an Ubercon, and for some reason we kept wiping. Maybe we were gonna like split up the guild or something. Not really, but we kept dying repeatedly and we couldn't figure it out. The tank kept getting ganked by an Ubercon. He was catching up because basically the fight works is you have to run away from him at a certain amount of time. And at that point, we asked our tank, like, dude, do you have run speed on your boots? And he didn't. And so basically, because he didn't have run speed on his boots, we had spent almost the entire night just continually getting wrecked as an Ubercon would catch up to him and kill him and just like wipe the raid. It was pretty funny. So after that, we made sure that all our tanks had the proper enchants on their boots.
I'm laughing like a Naxx veteran, but I actually didn't know about that run speed thing on the boots until about 2 hours ago when I was going through some of the forums.
Oh man, yeah, that was really brutal. And like another one I can think of is like kind of just like the community of early WoW, which was really great. I remember the first time I was playing, I came out of the starting zone. I was a human. I went into Goldshire, and I went up to a vendor, and I saw that I could sell my armor for money. And I'm like, oh, this is broken. I'm gonna get all this like copper and silver for my gear, and I vendored it all. But then I had no gear, and I was effectively in my underwear. I was so embarrassed. I was like really upset. I'm like, oh my god, I'm such a noob. But luckily, I was able to find someone that helped me out. They gave me directions to Ironforge and some money. I was able to go get some new pieces, become less naked, and went on a great adventure to travel all the way from Ironforge, which was really sweet.
You eventually hid your shame and wound up in Naxxramas.
Yep, under a new set of robes.
Fantastic. Well, look, that's a great note to go out on. Ayle, I cannot thank you enough. This has obviously been an epic chat about everything and anything Naxxramas. You've been so kind to take the time out late on a Friday night for me and the show and the listeners of Countdown to Classic. I just want to obviously extend once again a great thank you to you. It became very bloody clear to me pretty early in our chat. And I go into all these chats with a little bit of a leap of faith. And I'm like, I'm sure they know what they're talking about. And you exceeded expectations greatly. It's so obvious that you know Naxx like the back of your hand. You did such a great job. And I just want to say thank you.
Thanks a lot. I really hope I did it justice. And I hope people don't think I'm a fraud. But either way, it was one of the best times of my life reading that, and it's an experience that I'm looking forward to, like, definitely reliving.
No, if anyone wants to call you out, we'll get you to produce the gear. It's all good.
Absolutely. I'll post some screenshots on the Countdown to Classic.
Too easy. All right, mate. Well, look, I'll let you go. Thanks so much again.
Okay. Thanks, man.
And that's everything from that great call with Ayle, and thank you so much to him again for taking so much time out for Countdown to Classic. The day after that chat, Ayle was kind enough to take me on a guided tour of Naxx to supplement that call, and he explained things to me as we went through the content, showing me some of the encounters that I'd never seen in the Wrath of the Lich King days, and that was an absolute blast. So I'm very thankful to have found Ayle and have him join the Countdown to Classic Discord as well, where he's been really engaged and really great. And please do, all of you who aren't members of the Countdown to Classic Discord, find the link in the show notes, click on it, head on over there and join us. There is amazing Warcraft chat happening there on a daily basis. We talk about the game. We get into things. This isn't your daddy's Discord. We do things a little bit differently over at the Countdown to Classic Discord, and it is a very special, amazing place, and everyone there really does enjoy their time there. But with that, that's about it for the day. So thank you for tuning in, everyone. I can't say for certain when you'll hear from me next. I hope it'll be later this week, but as I said said, with the move, time will tell. But just a few very special thank yous just before I leave, and that goes out to my biggest contributors over at Patreon: Flowsy B, Palfurus, Permadrunk, Rarebit, Romani, The Anton, Wilson Ma, and Velarco. Thank you so much to those people for their phenomenal support of the show. I can assure you that Countdown to Classic would not be the same without their support. On top of that, another big thank you to supporters Bossman764, Hurlbert, Good Kisser, Myrtlebanks, Purgatos81, and Zudamos as well. But that's it from me for the day. Wish the lovely Dookie Bear and I all the best with this big move of house. So for now, signing off from Down Under, have a great Monday, everyone.